If you were going to tell me that you only wanted to listen to a single episode of the How to Be an Author podcast for the rest of your life, I would tell you that this is the one, because this is something that I have been thinking of for so long. And when I try to coach authors, this is the thing that kind of is the most revolutionary part of my writing coaching for them. There's something that is going to fix most story issues many of us have in our writing, and story issues are the central part of your writing, because writing a book is not so much about writing a book, it's about telling a story. Authors need to be amazing storytellers. That's what makes a book satisfying. If it's not a story, yes, it can be a work of philosophy, or it can be even a business book. Many times I tell you that, some of the things that I tell you apply to fiction or nonfiction, but in my opinion, anything from an article to a blog post to even a philosophical discourse is essentially a story. By moving a reader through a story, you really make them absorb what you're saying so much better. We are hardwired as humans to enjoy and learn by storytelling. So I thought that it would be crucial for me to tell you about how to write a good story. Because here's the thing. You know intellectually that a story is about setting, characters, and plot. You've heard of the story archetypes and the hero's journey, but somehow your story is still falling flat. Well, that's right. There are some things that we know intellectually, but we don't really know how to put them into action and how to actually apply all of that when it comes to the storytelling part of our book. I thought it would be especially perfect to talk about this today because it is day one of NaNoWriMo. So some of you may unfortunately be skipping this episode thinking to yourselves, no, I'm going to start working on NaNoWriMo super fast and I don't have time for anything else. But boy, if you're on a break from your writing or if you're commuting and you've started NaNoWriMo, let me tell you, this is going to be something that is going to save you so much time, and it's going to give you so much of a better result. When you finish that rough draft that you have, you're going to have a better rough draft that is a better story. So let's get started today talking about how to write a good story. We will, of course, be talking about some of the archetypes and the hero's journey, but that's not the most important part of writing a good story. If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Karena Akhavein, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation. Welcome to the How to Be an Author podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. I am so excited that you are here, and I'm really pleased that you're going to be finding out more about writing not just a story, but a good story. If you are Writing Coach on Demand listeners, you're going to have an extra bonus episode that's going to be digging deep into how to avoid some of the main storytelling mistakes that so many of us make. And whether you're just starting out or whether you are doing that self-editing on that rough draft that is very, very rough, or if you've gotten feedback from beta readers who are saying, I just can't stay invested in this story. All of these things are going to be solved by listening to the bonus part of this podcast episode. So if you're not a Writing Coach on Demand person, I hope that you take this as your sign to sign up for the program. Not only do you get bonus podcast episodes, you get worksheets and you get office hours with your writing coach, all for less than $1 a day. So let's start talking about a good story for all of us. You've heard of the hero's journey. I think it's important to touch on this because this is really where we kind of learned what storytelling is, we learned it through mythology. This is something that's almost genetically programmed into us. We react to a story that is satisfying. And that's how mythology works. That's how the Bible works. That's how children's stories work. They all follow this very simple monomyth known as the hero's journey. This is a sort of template for stories. Basically, it's a hero who goes on an adventure. They're victorious in some kind of a decisive crisis. And then there's this return home, and they are changed or transformed. Now, in just a little bit, we're going to be talking about the 7 story archetypes, because there are different templates, right, for this. But really, I would say that this monomyth idea, no matter what you believe, people have dismissed this concept as a little bit non-scholarly, and they're saying that there's a source selection bias, et cetera, et cetera. But this monomyth idea, which was kind of thought up first by Joseph Campbell, it does have at least some merit. We really are very kind of reactive to this sort of story because it's satisfying. So this is the first thing that I need to point out. A good story is satisfying. It's satisfying because it actually answers the reader's expectations. It gives them what they wanted. So for an example of a story that really follows this hero's journey or monomyth really, really closely, I would say that Star Wars by George Lucas, right? The film, that was classified as a monomyth when it came out. And if you look at what's happening, the hero's journey that happens, the crisis and the return home, all of this really fits that monomyth. And that's why Star Wars is something that has had such longevity. It's had such a great reaction. So you look at this, how you've got a monomyth, which is the framework, and the story spine. I always talk about a story spine. You look at this framework and you see how you can really plug any types of elements into it. So many times when I talk to writers about the story spine or Save the Cat or the monomyth or story archetypes, and I tell them that, try to make your story fit into this framework in a way, they initially have a sense of rejection where they're like, no, but I'm much more interesting than that and unique, and I've got a unique story. Yes, you have a unique story, but it still needs to be a satisfying story and fit into a framework in a satisfying way. Can you subvert some expectations? 100% you can. And you can have really unique bits that are going to be memorable, but you still have the responsibility of writing a complete and good story. So let's talk about expanding on this monomyth. We're going to start talking about the 7 story archetypes. And by the way, my structure in this podcast is going to be a little bit of kind of giving you the basics and then expanding on them. So I'm kind of playing with the structure of like, we're starting with this one monomyth, and now we're going to go to the 7 story archetypes. And then I'm going to give you like the 3 main elements of a story. And then I'm going to give you 11 elements of a good story. So I'll keep expanding. And then in your bonus materials, we're going to kind of double down on some of the most crucial things that are problem points for writers. So let's talk story archetypes. Your 7 story archetypes in general and in no particular order are rebirth, tragedy, comedy, voyage and return, quest, rags to riches, and overcoming a monster. Think about this. Let's talk about each one really briefly, right? So overcoming the monster, this is not literal, or it could be, right? If you're writing fantasy fiction and you've got some kind of a monster that is in another galaxy, sure. So what's that story spine going to be? It's going to be about a hero who has these characteristics that will enable them to be the person who's going to overcome the monster. You might have their journey to find the monster and the different steps in overcoming this monster. And then the end, which is going to be they've overcome the monster, and here is how their world has changed as a result, and here's how they have changed as a result. Are you seeing something here so far? It's not just about overcoming the monster. It's about a story arc that goes with that. Next, rags to riches. We start with a character who is poor but worthy. And they don't have to be literally poor. They can be emotionally poor, or they can be, lacking in the thing that they want in education, for example, or what have you. This is going to have a story arc where that character goes through all these challenges in their quest to go from poor to rich, whether it's in a literal sense or in a more figurative or metaphorical sense. Then we've got the quest. We've all seen these quest stories, which are pretty fun. Anything that's Indiana Jones is going to be a quest story with that hero who's searching for something. And in fact, their search might not be what they really needed, right? So you're going to have that flip-flop moment where they realize that they thought they were wanting this one thing, but in fact, they're going to get what they needed. That's the quest story arc. Then we've got voyage and return. This can be an eat, pray, love type of format where your character is going to go on some kind of a trip to discover themselves. And then when they return, that's not the end of their voyage. They are going to have some more challenges when they return because their relationships have changed, they've changed, their world has changed, all of that. You've got the comedy archetype where, you're trying to make your story yield some stuff that's, funny and that is going to teach your characters some lessons and is going to be a happy ending, as opposed to tragedy, where you have an unhappy ending based on the fact that your character has a tragic flaw. So you see here how your character is completely imbricated in the story. It's their characteristics, their desires, and their goals that feed what kind of story archetype we're dealing with here. So that's really important. You have to think in each story, not about things that happen, but more about moments that impact character development. That's really, really crucial. Too many authors don't have that causality. They don't have that plot that moves inexorably forward because they just have an assemblage of events. And these events might be impacting the world of their story, but they are not impacting the character. And that's where they fail. We're going to be talking a little bit more about that in the bonus materials. And of course, once my course from idea to published in 6 months comes out, you are going to have a full rundown of how to do this. But if you are a writing coach on demand person, you are already keyed into that. You're going to be getting that course. So that's great news for you. So now let's talk about these main parts of a story that are things that people must absolutely know. The most basic thing, when you start thinking of your story idea and trying to build it out into a plot, you're going to do two things. You're going to first think about the 5 W's, and then you're going to think about the story spine. So the 5 W's being who, what, why, where, when. And then the extra bonus, which is how. Your 5 W's, your who is going to be who are your characters, what is happening. The why is that happening? What are their goals and what motivates them as they go, and why does it matter? Why should we care? The where and the when being the setting and how the story is told in order. And then, that how can also be thrown in of, how do all these things fit together? How do they happen? How do things, set other things off? And this brings us to the story spine, which is once upon a time there was blah, your character, right? Which situation they're in. Every day, blah, until one day, this is your inciting incident, right? Until one day something happens that incites them to change what's going on with their life, call to adventure. Because of this launches us into the first part of the story. Because of that, this is where maybe there's a reversal. There's something that their actions have had consequences. Until finally, this is the climactic moment, the big scene that's going to happen to really determine what's going on. And ever since then, this is the ending. This is the new situation that your character finds themselves in. So that is your story spine. But let's expand that simple story spine. We went from 5 W's to 7 parts of the story spine. And now I'm going to talk about the 11 fundamental parts of a good story. Okay, and then we're still going to have to dig deep down, and I'm going to have ways to really make your story succeed beyond just having these parts to them. So the 11 parts of a story, most people say that there are less parts, but I really thought that I would add in a few parts that are really crucial, because this is what I'm going to be touching on for the rest of this episode. We've got our characters. It's not enough to have a character who's cool and that you're like, oh, I really like this character. Think of, why is this unique character going to be somebody that my reader identifies with and wants to follow along on a journey? That's the really important part. Why is this character uniquely suited to go on this journey? Why are they going to be capable of reaching the goals that they have? What is it about them that's compelling? And what is it about them that's going to be problematic? All of that's really important. And then when I say characters, it's not just the main character. You've got other characters. And I'm going to be telling you soon about one of those huge mistakes that so many writers make, that they have this enormous cast of characters that are just there because they're fun. That's not good enough. I'm going to be talking about what makes a crucial character. We've got our setting. It's not enough to think that, oh, my setting's so cool. It's a really neat world. It's pretty. It's interesting. No, that setting's going to need to be a character of its very own. It's going to be needing to actually impact what happens, whether it makes it easier or whether it makes it more difficult or whether it's falling apart or catching fire and your characters have to react. That setting needs to be integral, and we never want to forget where this book is taking place. We've got the plot. The plot is where your story really takes shape. That's really important. The plot is something that is driven by what your character wants. We're going to talk more about that. We've got conflict. Without conflict, the story grinds to a halt. Without conflict, your character gets what they want right away. Without conflict, there's no suspense. There's no kind of breathless, what's going to happen? Are they going to get what they want? Are they going to fall in love? Are they going to find the treasure? That's really important to have. There's the resolution, which is when that ending is actually satisfying. Many of my clients like to write series, and I commend that. I think book series are very popular. They're great. But too many times they think that writing a story that is part of a series kind of excuses them from having a good resolution at the end, and that is not the case, let me tell you. We also have these themes and morals. These things are going to be really interesting in making your book feel deeper. It's going to make it feel more like it fits into one of those archetypes. It's going to make it feel like it's something that is more universal, that people are going to care about beyond just the story of this one character. This is going to expand it into something much more, impactful, really. Then you've got symbolism. And I think that this is one of those gifts you give your readers when you have these really richly described situations and settings and events. If you can weave in some symbolism, it's really rewarding. That reader who is perspicacious, that reader who is really smart and a close reader is going to get these little gifts and extra takeaway. And they're going to be like, wow, I'm really seeing how this symbolism feeds into my theme. And this is really, really cool. The point of view and the perspective are kind of woven together. Those are super important. Who's telling the story and what's their perspective? What's their opinion on what's going on? Because this is a whole facet of the storytelling that you cannot lose track of. This enriches it so much. When you don't choose a strong point of view or a strong perspective to tell the story from, we're losing also part of the richness that you could have. If the reader knows that your main character, who's super sympathetic, has this perspective that this thing that's happening is disastrous and that's well communicated in the story, they're going to be that much more invested. They're going to be like, okay, this is my perspective too. This is my point of view too. I'm really invested now. And then we've got the ending. Again, I cannot stress this enough, that the ending is the last impression that your reader gets. It needs to be really, really strong. So here are the steps of really creating a great story with a fantastic plot. You really need to come to some understandings. First, you need to understand that a story is a complete entity. So it's more than just a scene or an anecdote. Those things are not a complete story. Those things are just, that could be a little standalone for something. But if you're writing a book, you really need to have a story that has a full beginning, middle, and end, and that really sucks that reader in. Now, of course, what's important in this is selecting a story that matters, that's meaningful. So don't think of something pedestrian. You need to inject something more into your story. And I'm not saying that everything needs to be over the top. Many times, younger writers will be writing things that are super dramatic, super highly fictionalized, thrillers, pulse pounding, this and that. That doesn't need to be the case. Your story can happen in the everyday world with everyday characters, but with a little extra spark. There's something a little bit more meaningful. There's something a little bit more deep, right? So if you wrote a story with a character whose mother is dying, for example, this happens every day, right? This happens to everyone, but your character is equipped in a different way to deal with this. The mother's death is going to mean something different to them. There are going to be higher stakes. And I think that's one of the big secrets to writing a meaningful story is to think about the emotional stakes in the story. Stakes don't just mean the end of the world. They really mean, what is this going to mean to this character that I'm super attached to? So as a next step, you're going to be developing your story. And that means you need to figure out the structure of it. You need to figure out which parts are essential to your story and what kind of order you're going to tell your story in. What works best in the way you tell your story, in the way it's structured. Does it go straight forward? Does it go through flashbacks? Does it have kind of subplots that feed into the story? That's really, really important. And then a fundamental thing is really understanding how your character has changed by the end. That is so important. That change, that transformation is what takes this from just some kind of blah thing to a story that really, really works. It needs to be really super, super visible that your character has changed in a fundamental way at the end. And then ask yourself, what's the best way to share this story in? Am I ready to do this? Have I prepared enough to write the story in the best way possible so that my reader can really absorb it? Because this is the issue, is that so many writers actually have something that could make a great story. They have a fantastic idea, but then they flounder when it comes to how to tell that story, and they do lose their reader. This is when you have a, did not finish, which is tragic for a writer to have readers kind of jump in and then just be like, I couldn't finish this. It was just not well told. That's terrible. So let's talk about how to avoid that happening. I want to give you my top ways to make a good story actually succeed for you. This is an art, yes, but there's a little bit of a science to it. There's some elements that if you really think about them and if you really take them to heart, your story is going to succeed more than it would otherwise. So my first little tip is I was talking about, make it a good story, make it a meaningful story, make it a strong story. Yeah, that's really important. You want your story to have strong, dramatic content. Okay, so not just the basic, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Yeah, that's everyday life sometimes, but how do we bump that up to be more dramatic? And I'm not talking about over the top. It can still feel pretty realistic to the reader because they're going to have this suspension of disbelief as they read because you are giving them the motivations of these extraordinary characters that kind of make the extraordinary character behavior more logical and believable, right? So that's the first element of the dramatic storytelling is your character's a little bit extraordinary in some way, which means that their behavior is extraordinary in some way and it makes sense. Now, the next thing you really, really need to make dramatic storytelling is conflict. Without conflict, as I said before, your scenes will just follow each other. And the minute your character gets what they want, which is going to happen super easily because there's no conflict, that's kind of going to be a lame story, right? So you need some conflict. And to have conflict, you need things and people, antagonistic forces that are working against your character and working against them getting what they want. If you haven't listened to last week's episode about the antagonist, you're definitely going to want to do that. But I know I said if you only listen to one episode, make it this one. But I think the antagonist episode is a really good one for you to listen to. Having these antagonistic forces also leads to there being tension and some kind of suspense, right? Some kind of suspense because you don't know if your character is going to be getting what they want. And that leads to a sense of surprise when certain things happen. I think that's really fun. That's much more dramatic. And if you choose a subject that's a little bit controversial, for example, or a little bit, extraordinary or unique, that's going to be pretty cool in upping the drama in your storytelling. Another way to make your story succeed is definitely through pacing. Pacing is so crucial. So this is where so many writers really fall flat, is where, they tell what's going on, but they are not actually pacing it right. Every event kind of happens with the same pacing. There's no variety in the rhythm and the structure. And somehow it really falls flat because I can't tell whether this particular episode or this particular event is more important or more crucial to the story than this other event. So I really want you to think about, and these things go hand in hand. So when there's a moment that's going to be very dramatic, why don't you slow down what's happening before? Why don't you give your character time to reflect on what might happen? Why don't you give them time to dread what's about to happen? And then when that thing is happening, you can make it more explosive, or you can go more in depth, or you can vary that structure, vary that rhythm so that the reader knows, wow, this thing's different than the other things that just happened. That's really important. I think that's really cool. A lot of writing instructors, I know that they say just generally write shorter sentences. Yeah, sure. I think that we overestimate our readers' ability to concentrate on sentences, but I think that varying and having some longer sentences can kind of give you a different pacing. You'll kind of feel the rhythm. It's like music. So if you're reading out loud, that's a really cool thing to do, to kind of feel like, okay, my rhythm is working or it's not. I think that that's really crucial. You don't want to just be one note. Now, also, I think that it's really crucial to have these characters, right, that are memorable. Why do we find some characters more memorable than others? Well, you need your character to be pretty unique. And for them to be unique, they need to have unique interests. They need to have a unique voice. They need to present themselves to the world in a really different way. Maybe they have a distinctive appearance. Maybe they've got this interesting way of speaking, or maybe they've got these interests that are really bizarre. You're talking about a watchmaker who will only use antique parts on their watches from people who died, right? I mean, that's a cool, weird character. How does that character look? How do they sound? What are their goals, right? And now we start to realize that as weird as this character's goals or motivations might be, our sense of disbelief has been suspended because we already know that the character is super distinctive. And so that's going to be very memorable. Now, you also need to make sure that each important story section is told in a way that's effective. That's really important. There are different parts of a story, like that inciting incident, or the beginning of a story, or the climax of a story. All of those parts need to work. They need to do their job. And that's one of the most important lessons, is to think, is my story doing the work it needs to do? Are my sections doing the work they need to do? That is so important, because sometimes we do really well on the opening, for example, and then we drift off. Or maybe we've got some great scenes, but those scenes don't really do their job. If they're not doing their job, your story is going to fall flat. Now, here's one other thing that a lot of storytellers say, okay, sometimes you can deepen your plot with a subplot. And this is where I say, really be careful. Because so many writers do subplots that don't really tie in with the story the way they should. And I'm telling you that your subplot needs to feed your main story, needs to feed your main plot. So your subplot is going to be designed for different things, like making readers care about your characters more, which makes your readers super invested, right? Or revealing characters' personalities in different ways, or making their goals more difficult to reach, right? Or adding symbolism or expanding on the theme of your novel. All of these things are great things to do with your subplot. And I think you need to think about that. Sometimes I'll write a story. If I have a subplot in a story, I'll write the whole main story first and then see how to weave in my subplot. I always tell my writing clients to create a separate outline for their subplot before trying to weave that in, and then find triggers for when you start to expand on your subplot so that your reader doesn't get confused and go, wait, what's going on now? Why did we just jump to this subplot or this side quest? I don't want the side quest to be on the side. I want it to be something that is undercurrent for your main plot. Get it? That's a really interesting and important thing that a lot of writers make that mistake where the subplot could be taken out and it wouldn't change the novel. If that's the case, do take it out. Because again, if your reader gets confused or if they don't understand why they need to care, you have lost your reader and you do not want that to happen. Another thing that I find is something that can either strengthen or weaken a story is dialogue. You really need to make every single line of dialogue count. So what is dialogue that counts? It's dialogue that gives you a sense of who your characters are. It's something that gives you more of that tension and conflict. It's something that serves the story in terms of having characters show what they want, what they need, or giving information that's going to be crucial for the story. That's really, really important. And it adds in some emotional elements. If your dialogue doesn't do this, take it out. But I think that dialogue usually really strengthens a story a lot. But you need to be careful about how you write it. Another thing that really is one of these huge ingredients as a storyteller, something that you cannot forget, is the immersive setting. Your setting can't just be a random setting that's there because it was interesting. It needs to be a setting that serves your story. I said a little bit earlier that your setting is a character in and of itself. It's a character that either facilitates things or makes things harder in the story. All of that's really important. And I never want to think that a scene's taking place in a confused setting. Too many authors are like, okay, I've got a castle and I've got a town in my setting, but then they don't think about how are the castle and the town related? How do my characters get from one to the other? What are the differences between these two settings? How can I really drive that point home so that without even describing the setting in the scene, my reader can tell where that character is? But I still want you to describe the setting and the scene. I want you to scene set really well all the time because I never want to be confused and go, wait, where is this taking place? And I don't just want to know where it's taking place by you telling me what's taking place in the subtitle of the chapter. Like, that's not enough to me. I mean, it helps as an extra little hint. I want to be immersed in that setting. And that is crucial. Really being in that setting, not floating in just this random universe. Like, that setting being super integrated into the story makes me feel much more invested as a reader. Now, the conflict and tension, I've mentioned this how many times in this episode? Why have I done that? Because conflict and tension need to be present in every single scene, and they need to be integral to how the story is progressing and what happens. There never needs to be a let up in this tension. I mean, you have some moments that are going to be more fun and games, more light, to give the reader a chance to breathe and a chance to be like, okay, woof, let me catch my breath. However, you really want a lot of conflict and tension so that the story moves forward inexorably. Now, can we just talk about the beginning of your story for a second? Because I think that this is so important. So many writers start their story in a way that they think is exciting, or they think is like, oh, I'm going to start on an exciting thing that's like a battle scene, or I'm going to start, in the middle of the action, like literally the character is hanging off a cliff or something like that. Sure, that can work sometimes in a Hollywood movie, but that's because in a Hollywood movie, you get to see that character. And those movie makers are very good at making you know certain crucial things about that character within the first few seconds that you see them. So already you're invested. For example, you're going to see the character and you're like, wow, that's really, here's Brad Pitt. He's very, handsome, and he's hanging off a cliff. And all of a sudden he does something kind of weird. Like he checks this watch that's broken, and you're like, wait, why does he have a broken watch? And why is he looking at it? And what's this handsome guy doing hanging off a cliff wearing this outfit, right? So we've now gotten all of the elements in a second. Well, in a book, it's much harder to do that. And your reader might be like, what is going on? Why do I even care that this character is hanging off a cliff? I mean, if you do it right, yes. But I think when you think about your beginning, really think carefully, because you are essentially setting up some kind of a question and a promise to your book. So you're kind of speaking to the reader. Like when you're starting a great beginning, it is creating these questions that the reader wants to have answers to. Like, who is this person who is so interesting, who's got this broken watch that they just looked at and they've got a feather in their pocket? And why are they doing that? And why have they been deposited, on cliff's edge? And why are they so strong that they can hang on to, the cliff's edge with their fingernails? All of these things are really important. And also the strong beginning is going to get readers hooked on your particular style of writing. Because never forget, you are a storyteller. You're here to give your flair to the story. And that's really important. You are not like anybody else. That's why people have favorite authors. It's not for the stories. Your favorite author could have any story handed to them or any kind of, plot idea handed to them, and they would handle it in a way that's completely different than somebody else. And that's what you love about it, right? That's pretty cool. So think about your storytelling voice and your writing style. That is so important. I also want to know right at the beginning of your novel, I really want to know who's the main character or characters. What's the key conflict? What makes the character interesting? That's really important too. So when I was writing my last book, Gone to Ground, which is hopefully coming out very soon, but currently sitting with a literary agent who's, wanted to see more and is certainly looking at it for a long time. But anyway, that book, I actually had a different beginning written for it. And then several of my beta readers were like, I actually think that it would be stronger to start in this way. And I fought it because I thought my beginning was really cool. But then I was like, what? They have a point. It's not just about me. It's about the reader. It's about the storytelling. And it's hilarious how even when you know these things intellectually, that's an example of that. I'm a writing coach. I can tell you what makes a good beginning in a second. But with my own writing, it is hard for me to be like, yep, you're right. This makes a much stronger beginning. When you start a novel in the right way, you really are promising your reader that they're going on an adventure with you, whether it's an emotional adventure or a physical adventure. They are doing that. And that's really, really important. And as important as the beginning is, the ending is key too. That, as I said, just is the last thing your reader sees. And if you leave them on an ending that's not satisfying, if you leave them on an ending that doesn't even raise more questions, but kind of give them the satisfaction that their character's gone through this wonderful arc, you have not written a knockout ending. And then finally, this is the most important thing. I'm going to leave you on my most important piece of advice. And this is something that, again, you know it intellectually, but when you're writing a book, you forget that you're writing a story, and too many writers write a book that's garbled. The story gets lost in their writing. This is our ego telling us, I need to write a pretty piece of writing. You're not delivering a story that's clear enough for your reader to get profoundly invested in it. So that's really crucial too, for you to know that, hey, I'm not just writing a book, I am telling my reader a story. And if they don't understand what is going on at all times, I'm going to lose them. And this is where having an editor, a writing coach, or beta readers is so crucial. It's that you are now going to tell them the story and tell them the story in a way that really gets them going. You can't lose somebody. Like if you were telling the story verbally, you would never go off on these side plots that mean nothing. You would want to get through it with suspense, with everything else. You would want to get through it so that the reader is hooked forever. So think of that. Like when you're rereading your stuff, when you're self-editing your stuff, think to yourself, if I were reading this myself, or if I were telling this to a reader out loud, would they understand what I'm talking about? Would they see how this fits in? Would they think that this actually should be in my story? Should I actually forget this part because it doesn't really matter to the plot? Listen to that little voice in your head and actually do that. Make it as clear as possible. And also, don't assume that your reader is reading at the same attention level that you are. look at things where you're like, I know this, but how does my reader know that? Look at the order of your storytelling and be like, should I introduce this first rather than last? That's crucial too. So in the bonus materials that come with the Writing Coach on Demand, I'm actually going to be telling you all how to tell the story in the right order, because there's a trick to it. And I'm going to be telling you that. And that'll also be in my course From Idea to Published in 6 months. So it's your choice which way you decide to go to get that extra information that's really crucial on telling the best story possible. But in the meantime, those of you who are doing NaNoWriMo, congratulations. That's going to be awesome. You can do it. Use dictation if you need to get those word counts up, because I want you to win. I want you to feel good about it. And I look forward to being with you all next time on the How to Be an Author podcast. If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.